This is chapter 14 to 15, topics 9D and 9H on global economy and international relations, made by Justin, Grace, and me. These are our learning objectives. We're trying to ask how did the global economy change and remain the same from 1900 to the present, and how did globalization change international interactions between states after 1900?
Our key terms and vocabulary words are the Cold War, the Great Depression, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Free Market Economies, Multinational Corporation, World War I, World War II, World Trade Organization, North American Free Trade Agreement, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Service Sector, Informal Economy, Bretton Woods System and Agreement, Economic Globalization, and the Great Recession. There were many events during the 20th century that led to changes within the global economy. Major events such as World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and the more recent Great Recession impacted the global economy and relations. World War I forced governments to focus on their economy, but was also a main precursor to the Great Depression. In return, the Great Depression was a precursor to World War II. World War I was more politically based, and World War II near the end transformed into biological warfare, but both found it necessary to have strong international relations amongst allies. But it seems there was no rest for wars, as the Cold War came a few years after World War II. Throughout these conflicts, the parties involved were taking major damage to their economies. For example, this led to the Soviet Union losing the Cold War after they couldn't keep up with the US, and international relations were vital. There are few continuities between the 1900s and the present. However, incidents such as the Great Recession of 2008 were able to mirror similarities of the Great Depression. Recessions and depressions are two different concepts, and while the depression lasted longer than the recession, both saw a major economic decline that led to new reforms to help the economy rise back up. Whether the impacts of these events are beneficial or not is heavily debated, and will no doubt continue to be debated as history continues to be written each day.
Okay, so first we'll start with the Cold War. The Cold War took place a few years after the end of World War II in 1947 and did not end until 1991. The Cold War stemmed from a conflict between capitalism and democracy versus communism, with mainly the US and the Soviet Union at odds, causing most, if not all, international relations to be strained therefore after. Most democratic countries, especially the Eastern European countries, sided with the US, while most communist countries sided with the Soviet Union. The US and the Soviet Union engaged more in proxy wars rather than through direct military conflict in order to avoid a nuclear apocalypse. Remember, proxy wars are wars that are started by world powers, but technically they are not directly involved, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. On the brink of an all-out military conflict against the Soviets, the US economy was very much a wartime economy. That meant high spending and low savings, as with most of the world. With the Soviets' communist government structure, the Soviets couldn't keep up with the US spending, ultimately leading to their defeat, marking the end of the Cold War. From the Cold War onwards, the US and Russia's relationship has never been repaired. Next, we have the Great Depression. The Great Depression happened in 1929 to 1939 and was a major precursor to World War II and brought the global economy to a standstill. Triggered by the stock market crash in 1929, the Great Depression was caused by misguided choices by the Federal Reserve and ill-timed tariffs. The Great Depression caused worldwide productions to dramatically decrease, leaving a large amount of people unemployed. Ultimately, the Great Depression was one of the factors leading to World War II, creating more division in the world. Because Germany, already devastated by their defeat in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, was in much debt, priming Hitler for his rise to power. Hitler used the economy as a fuel for his revenge. During the Great Depression, the global economy was not so hot, but new reforms such as Roosevelt's New Deal helped restore the economy. Furthermore, the Great Depression led to World War II, putting a strain on international relations. Now we're going to watch a video explaining more about the Great Depression.
The Great Depression was a dramatic worldwide economic calamity which started in 1929 and lasted until the late 30s. Most people believe it began with the U.S. stock market collapse of October 1929. By 1932, U.S. stocks were only worth 20% of what they were prior to the crisis, and 1 year later, almost half of all United States banks had failed. By 1935, roughly 750,000 farms had been lost to bankruptcy or distressed sales. European countries, debilitated by the debt they've accumulated due to World War I, dealt with a severe depression and a sovereign debt crisis ultimately emerged. In Germany, for example, unemployment reached 25%, and among other things, this economic disaster led to Hitler's Nazi Party becoming the top political actor after the 1932 elections. Worldwide trade was devastated by the Great Depression, with countries engaging in so-called trade wars by limiting imports, and by the same year 1932, global trade crashed to half of the pre-crisis volume. Unfortunately, trade wars degenerated into an actual armed conflict, which caused over 60 million deaths. World War II. Make no mistake, most wars have been caused by economic factors to a very large degree. Let's learn from the past and not let this happen again.
Moving on from the Great Depression, we now have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or also known as GATT. So, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was an international accord that lifted restrictive barriers on trade. Before the agreement was signed in 1947, protective tariffs, which are taxes on foreign imports, were at a world average of 40%, which is extremely high. With the agreement, tariffs were lowered, and some were even eliminated, encouraging more international trade, restoring the economy. As international trade increased, it repaired some of the previously divided/starved relations between countries caused by World War II and World War I. The GATT effectively lowered tariff rates down to less than 5% by the 1990s. So to recap, effects of the GATT included more international trade, thus restoring the previously demolished economy from World War II, the Great Depression, and then additionally helped restore the sour relations between countries. Next, we have free market economies. So what is a free market economy? A free market economy is an economic system that is based on supply and demand with as little government intervention as possible. In the late 1900s, the world started to see more countries shift to this economic free market economy approach, with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher being one of the bigger supporters. Switching to a more free market approach, the U.S. was able to thrive on the benefits of capitalism, proving how communist structures couldn't work on such large scales. Thus, the fall of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Multinational corporations such as Nike and Amazon, but not until later, took advantage of this shift, and production started to increase, benefiting countries around the world. With a more free market approach, the global economy started to get stronger as a result of more materialistic production from corporations. Finally, not only did the global economy strengthen, but also did international relations. And because free market economies encourage more international buying and selling, strengthening countries' relations with one another. And here we have a video on the free market economy.
Free market refers to an economy where the government imposes few or no restrictions and regulations on buyers and sellers. In a free market, participants determine what products are produced, how, when, and where they are made, to whom they are offered, and at what price, all based on supply and demand. A purely free market does not exist because all countries choose to impose some level of central decisions and regulations. For example, many countries forbid producers from polluting, pricing below cost, or being a monopoly. In addition, they often require minimum safety standards, disclosure of ingredients, licensing of certain professionals, and protection of original ideas, to name just a few. Many governments also control money supply to minimize the negative effects of natural economic expansion and contraction. Free market can also be more of a subjective term. In Western democracies, governments that are elected by citizens pass regulations. Therefore, these regulations protect a majority of citizens and reflect their values. These markets feel free to most of the citizens, even when they are highly regulated. In autocratic governments, non-elected governments impose major market decisions. These rules tend to feel oppressive, even if there may be fewer overall regulations. The pros and cons of a free market are subject to debate all over the world and are one of the major dividing lines between capitalist and communist economies.
Okay, so the last term I will be presenting is multinational corporations. So a multinational corporation is a corporation that is legally incorporated in one country, but that makes or sells goods or services in one or more other countries. Some examples of multinational corporations include Ford, Coca-Cola, Nestle, Toyota. Multinational corporations greatly contribute to strengthening of the global economy because they provide jobs internationally. With more people with jobs, it means more people with money, meaning more buying and selling of items globally, which is more international trade. With more multinational corporations in the 1900s, it promoted and forced more trade and more international relationships to be grown between countries, because countries would have some items that others don't. Additionally, having more multinational corporations in the mid to late 1900s was also a sign of a world shift to a free market economy, which allowed for a stronger global economy as a whole.
So, starting off with World War I, as we know, it officially started in 1914 and ended in 1918. World War I was the first global conflict ever, and there were many casualties. The main causes of the war being imperialist expansion and competition over natural resources. And along with this intense nationalism, escalated the small-scale conflicts into global war. And had this war been smaller and contained to a specific area, and had it not been a global war, then it may not have been as impactful on the global economy as it was. Because after World War I ended, which was basically a race to exhaust the enemy's economy, the Great Depression happened, and affected the global economy massively. And due to this massive increase of wartime spending globally, and after the war, almost every country was in debt. And after this, governments started taking more active positions in their economy. And another massive impact that World War I had on a global scale was that the war destroyed some old land-based empires and created new nation states. And not only this, but the war encouraged independence movements in European colonies such as India. Therefore, the US became a major world power. And international relations strengthened between allied nations and weakened between enemy countries or nations. And moving on to World War II. It started in 1939, ended in 1945, and the causes of the war were continuations from the First World War. And these continuations included conflicts and also effects of the Great Depression. Another major part of the start of World War II was the growth of extremist ideas such as fascism, totalitarianism, and authoritarianism, especially in Nazi Germany. And this led to aggressive militarism of Nazi Germany, and thus the Holocaust happened. But this time the casualties were much larger in quantity, and the actual warfare was on a much larger scale, since World War I was kind of considered more political warfare. Despite all of the casualties, it was still considered more political warfare than actual combat and biological warfare. And because the casualties were much larger, that meant there had to be more war, which means more global war spending. So, of course, global war spending rose to higher levels across all countries, so globally. And there was also massive competition on producing weapons and war materials, which opened up job opportunities across the globe. And in the US specifically, the unemployment rate dropped to 10% overnight. And because countries were in the middle of a war, international relations between allied countries and nations were important if that group wanted to win the war. So, of course, they strengthened between allied nations and weakened between enemy countries or nations. And moving on to a short video on World War II and how it affected the US economy. All right, and moving on to the World Trade Organization. In 1995, the World Trade Organization, shortened to WTO, took over GATT's operations, which Evan talked about shortly. Um, the WTO made rules that govern more than 90% of all international trade, which is a massive amount, a massive portion of international trade, obviously. But this ended up creating some controversy because people were concerned with the amount of international trade that the single organization controlled. And much of that controversy stemmed from the fact that its board members were mostly corporate. And on top of this, the rules that the WTO put in place favored trade over moral concern. So, an example of this would be that, let's say, a member of the WTO that refused to buy clothing made by sweatshop labor could suffer trade sanctions from the WTO. And this more or less damaged some international relationships between the member nations. And overall, the WTO helped global economy. As we saw during the past decade, the global economy has been growing from 1 to 6% each year, but it didn't focus much on the local economy and benefiting the local economy. It more helped the economy on a global scale. as you can see on the PowerPoint slide, it says international body representing 149 nations. So obviously it was a major organization that helped the economy on a global scale and didn't focus much locally. And moving on to NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. So by the late 1900s, major global powers such as the US and Canada were heavily industrializing and slowly spreading its wings to other countries. In 1994, the US, Canada, and Mexico negotiated the North American Free Trade, which is NAFTA. This agreement allowed US and Canadian industries to build maquiladoras, or factories, in Mexico that used low-wage Mexican labor to produce tariff-free goods for foreign export. This meant that the US and Canada could produce tax-free goods when they're importing for foreign export with low-wage Mexican labor. And of course, labor unions in the US and Canada complained about this and said that NAFTA led to the export of thousands of US jobs to Mexico where wages and benefits were lower. And although NAFTA was replaced in September of 2018, it was very successful. Between the countries in NAFTA, their international trade grew, and they all benefited economically, as two-way trade between the countries associated with NAFTA since 1993 has grown by 44%. And as a result of benefiting economically, their international relations also grew stronger as they did more trade and interacted with each other more. So my last vocab term is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or for short, ASEAN, which I'd like to pronounce Asian because it looks very similar. So Asian was one of several organizations that contributed to the growth of the global economy in the following decades of World War II. Asian, which stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations, was created and declared that they would work to accelerate economic growth, social progress, and cultural development. And Asian did just that. And today they're seen as one of the most successful regional organizations. So although Asian focused on about 10 Southeast Asian nations, they also took part in globalization, and that put them on the map internationally. And economically, the organization prospered, and the international relations within Asian were great as well.
Service sectors. The service sector is the third and largest sector, first and second being raw materials production and manufacturing. They produce services rather than goods. Services such as transportation, security, information, healthcare, entertainment, recreation, etc. The list goes on, and the service sector is very broad. The top countries that place the most stress on services are the US, UK, Australia, and China. Countries whose economies revolve around services rather than goods are usually seen as more advanced than those revolving around things like agriculture. Informal economy. According to the Women in Information According to WIEGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, informal economy is, and I quote, the diverse set of economic activities, enterprises, jobs, and workers that are not regulated or protected by the state. The concept originally applied to self-employment and small unregistered enterprises. It has been expanded to include wage employment and unprotected jobs, end quote. And informal employees are, and I quote, informal employees are those in regular employment who do not have. I'm restarting this bit. Informal economy. According to WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, informal economy is, and I quote, the diversified set of economic activities, enterprises, jobs, and workers that are not regulated or protected by the state. The concept originally applied to self-employment and small, unregistered enterprises. It has been expanded to include wage employment and unprotected jobs, end quote. And informal employees are, and I quote, those in regular employment but who do not have work-related social or legal protection, end quote. It is a fairly new concept as it was discovered in the 1970s, though no doubt it existed before that. The informal economy has a huge role in the global economy but is not acknowledged nearly enough. Most of the world works within the informal economy, with 2 billion people, or 61% of the world's worker population, earning their living through it. The informal economy can reduce poverty if supported correctly. The Bretton Woods Agreement System. Named after the location the conference took place in, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1949, the Bretton Woods system is an agreement made between 730 delegates from 44 countries to create a more efficient foreign exchange system. The capitalist countries from World War II wanted to avoid economic decline that was seen previously after World War I. It was created to promote international economic growth and to prevent the devaluation of international currencies. The Bretton Woods system disappeared around the 1970s, but from this agreement came the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, which are still crucial for current affairs such as international currency exchanges, global trade, economic growth, employment, etc. Economic globalization. Economic globalization is when countries, businesses, organizations, services, etc. work on an international scale. Whether the benefits are beneficial or not is being debated. Both the businesses and consumers benefit from globalization due to its help in decreasing manufacturing costs and increasing the number of jobs and children in school. There's also an increase in the standard of living in countries such as China and Vietnam who have benefited from globalization. But economic stability aids globalization and can harm countries without it. It can especially affect smaller businesses and communities that depend on jobs outsourced somewhere else. But there is no getting rid of globalization. Globalization has existed for centuries. However, it has rapidly increased due to things such as advances in technology, communication, trade, and transportation, etc. And it won't be going away either, at least not anytime soon. The Great Recession. The Great Recession was the longest economic decline since the Great Depression and affected countries worldwide. By the IMF's definition, a global recession is, and I quote, a decline in real per capita world gross domestic product, GDP, as reported by other macroeconomic indicators such as industrial production, trade, oil consumption, and unemployment for a period of at least 2 consecutive quarters, end quote. The Great Recession started in 2007 and ended in 2009, but many countries still suffered from its effects years later. The main cause of the recession was the failure of the financial industry worldwide. Countries like Ireland, Greece, Portugal, and Cyprus had to increase taxes and budget cut healthcare and retirement programs just to make up their debt. New financial regulations had to be introduced due to the Great Recession. In the U.S., the Dodd-Frank Act was signed in 2010 to help the government gain back some power over the financial industry.
My answer to my learning objective is which is how did the global economy change and remain the same from 1900 to the present, is that between 1900 and the present, there were significant amounts of conflict and events. Some notable conflicts being World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, which Evan highlighted, and some events being the Great Depression and the Great Recession. With these conflicts and happenings also comes major fluctuations in government structure and the economy. Overall, there aren't many continuities in global economy other than the specific economic structures of certain countries. For example, the U.S. Maintaining itself as a capitalist country, that would be considered a continuity in terms of economic structure. But overall, there were major fluctuations, as there are always fluctuations in the global economy. So some notable changes happened after World War I. As a result of the war, the entire world was launched into what is now known as the Great Depression, and it did catastrophic damage to the global economy, and many countries suffered, and a similar event happened during the Great Recession. Another major change was when GATT was implemented and barriers to trade were lifted. The most notable and significant change, though, has to be the shift to a free market economy. A free market economy, which Evan also talked about, allowed for the government to not have to be so controlling of the overall economy. And with this switch, capitalist countries such as the US benefited, and global economy as a whole grew stronger.
How did globalization change international interactions between states after 1900? Well, globalization had some positive and negative effects between states after 1900. On one hand, globalization meant increased international interactions between states because as multinational corporations became a thing and companies were growing and were in multiple countries, it led to more overseas production of goods. Additionally, with the rise of globalization, it meant that the rise of more free market economies, not just not pure free market economies, a more free market economy approach, which meant more wealth between countries, thus leading to more industrialization and modernization. Also, with globalization, countries were created more allies and asserted more influence. But that could also be viewed as a bad thing. As globalization grew, more countries asserted their influence and imperialism grew, which eventually led to messy breakups or decolonization and the eventual start of World War I and World War II. With globalization, countries became more polarized, leaving many countries to this day adversaries. See, like the US and Russia, or the US and China. So you could say that globalization created these now world powers and teams. It could also be seen as a good and bad thing.
Thank you for listening.